Hi, everybody. This is Craig Hardesty with Out on Film. And this year, as we celebrate 35 years of bringing Atlanta and Georgia audiences the very best in queer cinema, we are beyond thrilled to have inaugurated the first screenplay competition this year. When we think about queer film and artists and bringing the best in queer cinema, part of our mission is to represent our entire community and all the voices and stories in our community. And we had thought in this 35th year, in order to foster the development of voices and voices and stories that need to be heard and stories that need to be told, we wanted to start on the front end of this artistic process and really recognize the work that people are doing in screenwriting in the hopes of gaining recognition to this process and introducing the world to these stories early on in the hopes that it makes it a little bit easier for these projects to get made and come to fruition so that one day we'll see them in the actual festival for a full run. So I am very honored to announce this year's winners of our very first screenplay competition for our narrative short. Our winners are Roberto Fatal and Ali Meyers-Ohki for the screenplay of In Memoria. Congratulations, both of you, on this short script. And for our narrative feature for the screenplay of Magpie, our winner is Megan Mead. Megan, congratulations. And I want to congratulate all of you and really welcome you to Out on Film.
My gosh. Well,
thank you so much.
Yeah, just thank you for having us. This is like so amazing and such a been such an encouraging experience even before the festival, just getting to meet y'all and I'm definitely feeling the community the community with this festival is really positive.
Excellent. I want to ask Roberto and Ali, In Memoria is a beautiful script. I will tell you, I read it. I was reading it on a plane and I turned to my husband and said, I think I just read the winning script.
Oh my God.
So tell us a little bit, I want you to be able, tell us a little bit about this story and where it comes from.
Well, the story follows a family of a young 14-year-old and their parent. And sorry, their parent Luna, and Luna has recently gone through a procedure where they were defaulting on their student loans, and the only way to be absolved of their debt was to go through a procedure whereby their memories of their education were repossessed by the loan company, which had developed this technology. So the story is about Luna going through that and how the two of them cope as this family of two. Meanwhile, they're on the eve of Nakano, the child's quinceañera, and Luna had been a fashion designer. So the memories that were repossessed were of their education of fashion design. And they had been planning and making a dress for Nakano. And so the plans they had for this big celebration of Nakano's coming of age are kind of dashed. So we watch them cope with that and find resilience and healing even with this intense devastation. Anything you want to add?
No, it's just really nice to write a story about like a mixed, Chicano, indigenous and Japanese family in the near future, calling upon their ancestors and their cultures to help them get through devastation that's been caused by like Western capitalism and tech, excited to have that kind of story out there.
And Megan, Magpie, I will tell you, when we were reading it and discussing it, we were also casting it in a variety of different ways. We were having a great time doing it. So tell us a little bit about Magpie and where this story comes from.
So the story of Magpie is definitely a largely autobiographical type of story. It's based on my own coming of age story, but actually it's also based on my grandma's end of life story. So when I was about 16, she was diagnosed with cancer, and she, like, her primary caregivers were my mom and I. And like, it was just really interesting because when you're at that period of stage in your life at 16, you're, seeking independence, you're coming into your own identity, even though you have no idea what the hell that is. Especially when you're a queer person like me, growing up in a very evangelical setting. Like, I really had no context for what being gay meant, or even that all the feelings I was feeling were very gay feelings for my friends. But what's interesting is that my grandma, while I'm gaining independence, she was actively losing hers, just as her illness was really taking a hold. And so that just caused a lot of tension in our own lives. But in the context of the script, it sort of is funny because the grandma is acting out in a very similar way that Margie is in the story. Like, she is they're both having their own rebellious grabs at independence, but just in different ways. And so as much as Margie and Marilyn are at odds with each other, they are actually very similar people, despite what Margie would hope, because she definitely has that sense in which she doesn't want to grow up to be like her grandmother, who is a very she's very spunky, but can just be very unpleasant. so and the other thing with the story of Magpie, so Magpie is definitely is a comedy of errors in a lot of ways too. And for my own family, the way that we process trauma and grief has always been through jokes and through humor and through storytelling. And so it just felt like this story was very was very true to my own experiences and my family's own experiences with going through that period in our lives, and just the complication of figuring out all these gay feelings while very, very large other things are happening in your life, more things with family mortality and all that stuff. But yeah, it's basically that's kind of like a Spark Notes version of the script. So many things are happening. There's because faith was such a big part of my life growing up, the way I personified that is there is an imaginary white Jesus that follows Margie everywhere she goes. And when she's feeling lonely and stuff, she's talking to him, and he's very irreverent, because I wanted it to be a little ambiguous about whether this Jesus is actually there, or if he's more of a personification of her own consciousness, just needing someone to talk to when she doesn't have anyone to talk to. But yeah, that's kind of that's a little bit about the story.
So one of the things that struck me in both of these scripts, and in a lot of the films that we screen and that we show, there is so much of our story, and what comes through in both of these scripts is this idea of belonging, and where do we belong in the world, and how do we find it, and how do we maintain it. And I think Roberto and Ali, one of the things that was so beautiful in the script, and I'm not going to give it away, but one of the things that was so beautiful is near the end is this beautiful moment of connection where they find each other again. And I think, Megan, you do the same, where these women kind of find their places in the world, and who they are and in relation to each other. So, let's talk a little bit about, as queer people, that we are always seeming to be in search of where we belong and how we connect and who we connect to. So I'll start with you, Roberto, and Ali, talk a little bit about that kind of search for belonging and connection in your script.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is particularly important, it's like, I mean, definitely this is a queer script, it's like a non-binary queer family. But I think one of the other things that's probably maybe more important, especially for the question about belonging, is that this is like a POC family, right? It's like Luna is a Mexican indigenous immigrant, similar to my like grandmother, and my, Nakano, or I mean, this late wife Miyoshi, who's in the script, is this Japanese queer woman, and their kid is this mix of cultures, right? And so, some of the memories we see that have not been removed from Luna's head as they're going through this exit interview with this loan company is being put into like an internment camp as a child, like, the Trump internment camps, like they're one of the children that are locked up in one of those facilities, or they remember vividly being ripped away from their mother's arms by ICE agents. And right, so Luna's, when we, like, for us as like QTPOC folks, it like belonging comes from like so many different places, especially when you're talking about like an immigrant experience. That adds like another layer on top of that. When you're talking about being indigenous, or being two-spirit or non-binary, there's like a whole other layer there as well. And in family, in tradition, in ancestry, as complicated as it is one of the places that our characters find home, and they find themselves and find belonging.
Yeah, and in the family they make for themselves when they've been pushed out of some of their other families or separated from their other families. So I think that's part of that moment at the end for sure. Yeah.
But there's such an affirming moment here where I don't want to say against it, but all of the obstacles sort of and what Luna is going through, there is such strength and resiliency with them that really comes through. I don't want to say, it's not cliched, it's not, against the machine, but it's really how resilient and strong they are to be able to maintain in the face of the adversity immediately that they're going through, to find each other and keep each other.
Yeah, I mean, indigenous people are resilient. Mexicanos and immigrants are profoundly resilient people. And, like Ali's Japanese ancestors, like grandparents being put into like the internment camps in the United States and being being displaced from their Japan towns and cities that they used to come from that were decimated after, the internment of World War II. Like there's a resiliency to like the lineages we come from.
Right. I think as enduring as the forces that are stacked up against us, so are the impulses for connection, and so are the traditions of resiliency and resourcing with your own community. I think part of what happens in the script is that the Luna and Nakano both get lost in shame for a little bit, and there's a role reversal that's very confusing for them. And when they do reconnect, it's shedding some of that, and that's something that, yes, our ancestors have a huge legacy of having to do to just keep going and feel okay. So yeah, I feel proud of that moment for sure.
It's a beautiful moment. I'm just going to tell you, it's a beautiful moment.
Thank you.
And Megan, you have 3 very strong women.
Yes, like to put it
Very
lightly.
strong. Who, like you said, are navigating their world as it is changing.
Yes, as it is changing, as they're all 3 broaching very unfamiliar territory too, and trying to figure out how these changes in their lives are actively affecting their own identity, like their own personal sense of their own identity. Like with Marilyn, the grandmother, having always been a very headstrong, heavily independent person her entire life, suddenly being reliant on a daughter that she's been estranged from. for a long time, and having to suddenly rely on these people that she insisted all of her life, thinking she didn't need them, that she didn't need anybody. A lot of the connection between the three women really comes when they're finally able to just admit their mutual need for each other and their need for connectedness with one another in their lives. And it's just interesting because the way I see it is that Emma, the mother, and Margie, the youngest daughter, there's this sense in which they're all inheriting that same fierce sense of independence, and they're all trying to exert it in their own way. And it's really when they let those barriers down that they're actually able to like really see each other and accept one another and be able to accept themselves too. That's something that's very intrinsic to Margie, the teenager storyline. Because for me, coming out, I'm very fortunate in that my family was really supportive of me, but the person who was the least supportive of me was myself. Like I struggled with a lot of like suicidal tendencies and stuff, just coming from the church and having all these very internalized like homophobia within me. My biggest journey coming out was actually learning to be okay with myself. And that definitely is reflected in Margie's storyline, as she is just, the more she runs away from herself, the more disconnected she feels with herself and with everybody around her. And that, I think, just her being able to accept those pieces of herself allows her to be able to accept some of the pieces of Marilyn that she didn't want to accept. Using a lot of the same words. A little bit of a babbler, but yeah.
So, one of the reasons that we have felt so deeply about, queer film and artists and our stories, and a lot of the people ask us, even, in this day and time, is a queer festival still necessary? Is it still relevant? And my answer is always the same, is that yes, it is. It is important because we need to provide platforms for artists and audiences to connect with stories, whether it's our own stories that we see reflected on screen, or if it's stories of queer people that may not be our experience, that we can then connect to in a way that gives us a deeper understanding and bond with each other. And, and let's just go a little radical here for a minute. I think that queer people need to tell queer stories. And I think that, this platform that we are able to give, artists and patrons to experience these stories, I think is vital. So I just, from each of your perspectives as artists, as writers, just talk a little bit about developing voice and developing the stories that you want to tell, that live inside of you. So Ellie, what's your perspective on that?
Well, it's interesting. I was just thinking about how, so I also write fiction, and a lot of my emphasis there is historical fiction, kind of imagining queer characters in situations in my family's history where there are no stories, even though of course we know they were there. So it's kind of like, I know those ancestors were there, and I'm creating them. It's like a spell almost. And I think, and Rob works a lot in science fiction and in futuristic ideas. So it was really exciting to collaborate, because there too, in a lot of futuristic ideas, it's like, where did we go as people of color, often not represented? Where did we go as like gay and queer people and gender diverse people? It's like, I guess we didn't make it, So I think a lot of voice for me has been either like, yes, there we were, and yes, there we are going to be. We've been here, we will always be here. And also just sort of, I think we're standing on shoulders of people who worked through a lot of like narratives that got old, right? Where like someone comes out and then they die, or like turn straight at the end. And now we get to tell these stories that are just really character driven, derived from our own experiences, because people had to sort of work within the mold before we could break it. So I feel really grateful for that.
And Roberto?
I mean, I think these kind of festivals and like specifically these kind of competitions are important because oftentimes before I want to take something out to a larger community of, non-Indigenous, non-Latino people or non-queer folks or non-binary or gender diverse folks, I want to test that stuff within my own community, and I want to hear my community's thoughts first and foremost. I don't want to hear some straight random dude who like I don't know and just would never kick it with on the weekend. Like if I do want that person to like see himself or herself in our work, just like, as queer people, we've had to find ourselves in straight characters for a gajillion years. It's like I want them to find themselves in our characters. I want them to have empathy for our people. But first and foremost, like I want to workshop a lot of these ideas with our people first and foremost. Like that feels like the most important thing for me. I also think like at these festivals, critical thought gets driven, right? Like we're not having the same conversations as queer, trans, non-binary, ace folks that we had in the 70s, that we had in the 40s.
Right.
And it's through gathering where thought gets pushed and challenged and critiqued, and we refine our thoughts and we expand and we grow. And so it's like we have to have these things. We can't be trying to do this on our own or trying to survive as these like soul non-binary or QT/POC people amongst the sea of like straight white folks or whatever it is. Like we really do need to have this like diverse collective of LGBTQAI plus folks. Like we have to have that for thought and cohesive progress to happen. It's essential.
And then Megan, kind of building on that, what's your perspective on the centering on queer voices and queer stories?
Well, I think it's so necessary because even within the queer community, there's so much diversity and so many like very like just specific experiences, like whether you're a white queer person, whether you're a Latino queer person, whether you're a trans woman or a non-binary person, and just how those different identities intersect. I think having a space to be able to like tell these stories in a way where you don't feel like you're having to explain yourself to someone, like you feel like your story can just be seen, like, and be seen and be understood in a way that feels deeper than just someone who is kind of just like a spectator to your community, or is someone who's still in the learning process of your community, which I mean, we all are always learning about one another, but I don't know, I think there's something very worthwhile in having these queer spaces to be able to share art with one another and in that be able to share like these, I don't know, not just like affirming stories, but some of our more complicated like fears and emotions, all the things that we're dealing with in our own art. Because I think every queer person, when they're writing something, whether it's a queer story or not, they're endowing like a piece of their own, like, I don't know, their own soul and their own like emotional processes that they've been through over the years. So it's just, I think it's, yeah. Whenever I see films made by my other queer friends, it just feels very encouraging, I guess, for me anyway. And so
Right.
being in these kind of spaces, like it gives me more fuel for my fire, I guess, for me to like keep making things, for me to keep delving deeper into the stories that I'm writing.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that when we were looking at kind of what were we looking for in scripts and what was going to speak to us, part of what we wanted to experience is something that I think is happening across the spectrum in queer storytelling. And as I've been involved in it for as you can see 100 years. There is this really, really beautiful evolution of storytelling that, and I don't mean to down coming out stories. We will always have coming out stories. We will always need to have coming out stories. And I always want to have coming out stories. But I also love these stories where we've already come out. And we start, kind of out, and we start in the world. And it's, and Allie, it's something that you kind of said before. It's, there is a life beyond coming out, and there's stories after that. And I think what speaks to us with these scripts too is that life, the entire complexity of our lives and experiences and what happens to us in the future. It's kind of nice to know that we're there somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, do you all feel that evolution as well?
In just like queer and trans cinema, like in general, about the evolution of the story. Yeah, I think so. Like, I moonlight as a film professor, and so I study and I teach a diversity and film studies class. So I like to say I have like some kind of a knowledge about queer and trans cinema in general. But I think one of the things too is like the whole kind of like 90s 2000s coming out cinema was because I think that was a big coming out for queer and trans people, like in Hollywood. It was like we're here, we need to like kind of, this is like our coming out time. And we're a little older now, and we've lived a lot of different kinds of life, and the times now that we're coming out in are so radically different that it makes sense that our narratives are changing. It's like I don't know. And I, even with younger folks, like my students who were like 17, 18, 19, 20, their experience of coming out is so radically different from even ours, And so just the traditional coming out narrative felt like it was very much of an era, like I don't know. It just feels very different now. So I love that as we, those films have paved such a way for access for so many different kinds of like queer, trans, non-binary folks, that we're living in the world where those coming out stories and their impacts have reshaped our world. And now our younger generations are living in the world that we helped reshape. And so the narratives are totally different now. Yeah. And that's, again, why these festivals are so important, is not only do they actually really shape the reality and the futures that we live in, because their stories are medicine and their power, right? But then we get to then come back to these festivals where these stories get shaped for our youth. And then we get to go, okay, where are we at now? Where do we want to go in the future? And then how do we write narratives about that? Like we're in this interesting feedback loop where we're not in a bad way, but where we're in real time feeling the change that our stories have caused, and we're seeing that. And I think it's a beautiful thing.
And Megan, how have you experienced this evolution in storytelling?
First of all, wait, I just wanted to say, Roberto, I wish you could have been my film professor.
I would love to have been your film professor. I thought he was a classmate.
Yes, oh my gosh. But no, it's interesting because even for me, because I think when it's been about, like 10 or 12 years since my initial coming out process. And I can remember even just 12 years ago, like how much more dire the need for like queer content was, and just how like I don't know, just how now the level of specificity with which we're able to tell our stories, the fact that we're queer creators openly out and creating queer content is even like, not to like, you know, to beg over like breadcrumbs, but even that, like, to me is just like so mind-boggling, because I can remember a time where the only person that I was actively aware of being like out in the world was Ellen. I mean, that just shows how sheltered I was. So
I knew you were gonna say Ellen too. That's why. That's how small it was.
that you
I was
knew,
like,
no, it was so small.
Say
Like, and
Ellen.
so, and especially, you know, if you're like a lesbian, like growing up like in primarily white spaces, like that's really all there was. And there wasn't like this vast variety of like streaming services that were giving more opportunities for indie filmmakers to actually make these projects that were a little bit like closer to the quick of like of I don't know, just like our own stories. I think what's interesting about what you were saying about this feedback loop, we're in a time now where we are kind of having to question more like, what kind of stories do we want to tell? We have more of these platforms now. How are the stories that we're telling now going to shape the future, basically? And I think there is like, it's interesting because there's a certain level of like responsibility that comes with that as storytellers, but then there's also like this incredible sense of freedom and possibility as well. And that makes me really excited, even just the fact that we no longer have to explicitly exist in the romantic genre. Like, that's something that, like a short that I just produced recently is like this dark comedy where it like has this non-binary mail carrier that's obsessed with murder podcasts, and they like see this guy out on their route that looks like one of the serial killers from their podcast. So like it's just this whole thing where we're allowed to be funny, we're allowed to be sad, we're allowed to be problematic, like our characters anyway in these stories. Like, there's enough queer content now where we get to tell things with more complexity. We're not having to necessarily cater to just a straight audience anymore. Like, we get to cater to our own audience now. And is something that's just really, it just makes the possibilities feel endless at the, like, I don't know, for me as a writer right now.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Well said.
So what's next as we wrap up here? Tell us, Megan, what are your next steps for Magpie?
Oh Lord, funding.
Okay.
I do have we have a team, like I have a business partner where we make, I mean, like I was mentioning earlier, we produce our own shorts a lot of the time. And so one of the reasons why I submitted Magpie to y'all's festival is because we actually would love to film it in and around Atlanta, because that's where I spent a lot of my early life. And all my family is from the South. And so, but I mean, that's something where that might be 3 years from now, 5 years from now. In the meantime, I'm just going to keep writing and creating things. But yeah, just keep on making those queer stories.
And Roberto and Ali, what are the next steps for In Memoria?
Well, certainly winning things like this helps us appeal to producers potentially, or for funders. We're in early steps of approaching some friends we've worked with before as producers, but we do not have money yet.
But
So that's definitely a next step. We definitely want to see this film be created, and would love to submit it again when it's complete. And we're also collaborating on a feature script
of In Memoria as a feature.
Oh, good, excellent. And that's why I wanted to ask what's next, because those of you listening to this out there in our audience, part of the reason that we do this and we want to promote queer voices is to give people a chance to access financing and production, because we would like to be able to screen these films at the festival, and maybe not in a little bit less than 3 to 5 years, if possible. So I think it is important. And one of the reasons that we wanted to have this competition and this avenue is to be able to promote news stories in the hopes that we can engage a segment of our community to help to bring these projects to fruition. So I want to thank and congratulate all of you. We have Roberto Fatal and Ali Meyers-Ohki for their award-winning script now of In Memoria, and Megan Mead for your award-winning script, Magpie. Congratulations. Thank you for sharing your stories and your art with all of us here at Out on Film. And for all of you watching this, please continue to support queer art. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.